So, when I ask, what is Odoo? What comes to mind? Well, Odoo is a bit of everything. Odoo is a suite of business management software that some people say is like fertilizer because of the way it promotes growth. But some people also say Odoo is like a magic beanstalk because it grows with your company and is also magically affordable. But then again, you could look at Odoo in terms of how its individual software programs are a lot like building blocks. I mean, whatever your business needs, manufacturing, accounting, HR programs, you can build a custom software suite that's perfect for your company. So what is Odoo? Well, I guess Odoo is a bit of everything. Odoo is a fertilizer, magic beanstalk building blocks for business. Yeah, that's it. Which means that Odoo is exactly what every business needs. Learn more and sign up now at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com.
Hi, this is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford, and we want to tell you about our true crime podcast, Criminology.
Launched in 2017, we've covered every kind of case you can imagine, from puzzling missing persons cases to mysterious murders.
Some of the cases we cover are the biggest in true crime history, or they're high-profile cases that are currently making headlines, while some of the cases are fascinating ones you likely haven't heard of.
We cover both solved and unsolved cases, and we have 300 episodes available to binge on right now, including full seasons on the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and Ted Bundy.
You can listen to Criminology on your favorite player or app, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
You're listening to Campus Killings, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Citizen Detective. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Hi, Amy, and hello, listeners. Today's case takes us out of the United States. We'll be heading to the South Island of New Zealand for this story at the University of Otago. While New Zealand is ranked as the second safest country in the world, only beaten out by Iceland, for those who might not know, in terms of crime and violence, it unfortunately did not save a young economics major named Sophie Elliott from the dangers of domestic violence. And even more unfortunately, Sophie met her abuser in the very place she should have felt safest, her university. And before we get into this episode today, I just want to give a trigger warning that we'll be talking about the details of domestic assault and some of the more brutal particulars of this murder, so extra listener discretion is advised on this story. All right, Amy, as we normally do, let's start by learning a little bit about the university where events take place. Founded in 1869 by early Scottish settlers, the University of Otago is the oldest higher education institution in New Zealand and began by conferring degrees in art, medicine, law, and music. After opening to students in 1871 with only 3 professors, the school quickly grew through the 19th century, adding degrees in accounting and theology, as well as a dental school. And while it started as one campus in the town of Dunedin on the southern coast of South Island, Otago currently has several satellite campuses in most of New Zealand's major cities, including Christchurch, Wellington, and Auckland. As of 2016, they had over 20,000 students between their main and satellite campuses, offering a full range of degrees in everything from health sciences, performing arts, social work, economics, and biomedical science. And as part of New Zealand's national commitment to the indigenous Maori tribes, students are encouraged to learn the Maori national language, Te Reo Maori, and use it at the university. They offer many classes and certifications to become a Te Reo Maori speaker, And their website and official paperwork are available in both Te Reo Maori and English. As I said before, their largest campus is in Dunedin, one of the largest coast cities in the South Island. It was also the home of Sophie Elliott and her family. So now that we have some background on the school, let's meet Sophie. Sophie was the youngest child and only girl of the Elliott family. She was one of those young women who just seemed to have it all. Sophie was smart, congenial, popular at school, academically gifted, and very creative. By high school, Sophie was doing nature photography. She participated in ballet. She was an avid piano player, and she had top marks in all of her classes. So this is an extremely well-rounded young lady. She was so academically gifted, in fact, that she was awarded a full scholarship to any university in the country at her high school graduation. And she was salutatorian for her graduating class. Her former principal described her as having a drive that would, quote, see her achieve great things. And not only was Sophie academically gifted and talented, but she had an incredibly close relationship with her mother. As the youngest of the family, Sophie's two older brothers had both moved to Australia by the time Sophie was in high school, and their father often traveled for work. So this really left Sophie and her mother, Leslie, alone most of the time. So I think this was really nice bonding time for mother and daughter. Throughout Sophie's middle and high school years, the two formed a close bond that Leslie would later describe as less mother and daughter and more like best friends. Sophie confided in her mother about everything. And while we don't know for sure, perhaps this close relationship is what prompted Sophie to select the University of Otago as her school of choice, because this would allow her to remain in Dunedin and live at home while still attending an academically rigorous college. Okay, like high school, Sophie was an excellent student in university, earning top marks in her economics classes and gaining the favor of her professors and peers. However, in the last year, she began to have some confusion in her econ classes, and she felt like she needed some extra tutoring in order to keep her grades up. So in the winter of 2007, Sophie began taking tutoring courses with one of Otago's recent econ postgrads, a tutor by the name of Clayton Weatherston. And things seemed innocuous enough in the beginning. By all accounts, Clayton was a good tutor, and Sophie began to excel in her classes again, which was really the reason she was getting tutoring. But the professional contact took a more personal turn in the spring of 2007 when Clayton was working late in his office. So this was one day he was working and he was hungry. He wanted to get something to eat, he said, but didn't want to go to dinner by himself. So upon leaving his office, he noticed that Sophie was also working late in one of the university's study halls, and he invited her to join him for dinner.
Sorry if you said this, but is he around the same age as her?
I think he was a little bit older because he was a postgrad.
Okay, but they're not there's not a big difference between their ages.
Actually, yes, there was. I think it's a good question for you to ask. Yes, he was a lecturer. He was working towards his PhD, and there was a 10-year age gap.
Oh.
So for point of reference here, she was 21 and he was 31.
And also, it's probably frowned upon because he's her superior, correct?
You know, this is something that we've talked about in our schools, if you think about it. Some schools, as we know, Amy, have actually policies like fraternization policies where that's not allowed, but others leave that kind of open. So remember at one of the schools we attended at John Jay College, they kind of left that open. But if you recall, it opened the door to some serious scandals and problems. So I'm not sure what Otago's policy was on this, but in general, I do think it's frowned upon. Now, by some accounts, Sophie saw Clayton's dinner invitation as a way to network in her field. She also knew that he had worked in the National Treasury before coming back for his PhD, which was something Sophie was interested in doing. So perhaps she accepted because she was hoping to find out more about a job opportunity, or perhaps she was attracted to the fact that he was older and seemed more mature, or perhaps she was just being polite and accepting a dinner invitation from someone she worked with. Whatever the reason, Sophie said yes to her tutor, and the two apparently shared a pleasant meal, followed by several others. In fact, by the summer of 2007, this professional relationship had turned romantic, and the two began to date exclusively. However, what should have been the honeymoon phase of a brand new relationship turned out to be an incredibly disappointing and distressing time for Sophie. Within only 3 weeks of being exclusive, Sophie reported to her mother that Clayton often ignored her texts, was usually late for their dates, and would forget to call her even when he promised he would. It seemed odd to Sophie that someone who had courted her so much over the spring was suddenly always emotionally unavailable now that the two were dating exclusively. Sophie's mother also found Clayton's behavior suspicious, especially since Clayton often went out with colleagues and friends, but never invited Sophie to come with them, even though he regularly asked her to pick him up from these social outings.
Was he hiding their relationship maybe because he was embarrassed of the fact that she was a student and he was a lecturer?
Certainly, it might look that way right now. According to Leslie, Sophie wouldn't hear from Clayton for days, and then when he'd finally call her, she'd have to maneuver her schedule in order to see him, or at least that was the expectation. And things only got worse. As the longer they dated, the more Clayton seemed to need constant reassurance of his sexual prowess, demanding Sophie rank him in comparison to her previous boyfriends.
Oh, these are red flags. Yes.
These are huge red flags. In fact, this section, just so you know, is titled Red Flags, is what I put down here. They fought over this ranking system constantly as Clayton badgered Sophie relentlessly, basically to say that he was the best lover she'd ever have. Yeah, this is not good. And one day, just so you know, when she'd had enough, she told him that he was not, in fact, the best.
No. Did he fly off the handle?
Well, following this argument, Clayton began making demeaning remarks towards Sophie's appearance, including calling her fat, telling her that her eyes were too far apart, that she had an ugly chin, and picking on other areas of her body that he basically knew she was self-conscious about.
Oh, boy.
This is not a Prince Charming here. This led Sophie to end the relationship after only 3 months. But somehow Clayton always seemed to apologize and get her to come back. This pattern of Clayton pulling her down until she broke it off and then him convincing her to come back continued for almost 6 months. But despite this tumultuous relationship, Sophie still had her dream of working for the Treasury Department. And in the fall of 2007, she had her opportunity. Traveling from Dunedin to New Zealand's capital of Wellington, Sophie got an interview with the Treasury Department, and she nailed her interview, getting a job offer in the Treasury's graduate program to begin in January 2008.
Good for her.
So this was an exciting time. She was ecstatic coming back home to tell her family and Clayton the good news. However, Clayton was angry at Sophie's new position. While he had worked at the Treasury also, he'd only lasted 9 months before returning home. Now, at the time, he said it was due to some ongoing health issues that prevented him from doing the job. But later reports revealed that Clayton was greatly disliked by his peers at the Treasury, and his lack of popularity was really what caused him to go back to the University of Otago to get his doctorate. So I don't think that's...
Not surprising.
Yeah, I don't think so. Now, upon finding out that Sophie would be taking a position at the Treasury, Clayton threatened that he would call the few contacts he still had and ruin her reputation before she even started.
Why? Didn't he break up with her? No, she broke up with him, but he really was not treating their relationship with any sort of respect.
Absolutely not. He was abusive. And let me tell you, this was the last straw for Sophie, who ended their relationship for the final time in November of 2007.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Free from Clayton's abuse, Sophie began to rebuild her confidence and her life. By late November, all her exams were finished, and she'd graduated with her bachelor's in economics. To celebrate, she took a 2-week trip to Australia with her best friend and began preparing to move to Wellington for her Treasury job upon her return. This is like the best time in life. Do you remember this? When you have an exciting new job and you're on the precipice of starting your life. Oh, my goodness.
So fun.
For me, I had a vision that I would take a couple of weeks off. My father had a different vision probably and told me that I would be getting a job pretty quickly because, the money train, it was over.
What did you end up doing?
I actually wound up getting a job that I started 3 days after graduation as a paralegal. I came home, enjoyed the weekend, and went to work. How about
Good for
you?
you. I was working while I was in school, and then I just continued. Like I never, like I was working full time, like at the
Oh.
end of college, and then yeah.
Oh, wow. You're more impressive than I knew, Amy. Okay.
Thank you.
So while Sophie was, on the precipice of beginning this very exciting time, it seemed that Clayton had moved on as well, finishing his PhD while Sophie was traveling.
Okay.
In December of 2007, Clayton threw an enormous party to celebrate the completion of his PhD, and he invited Sophie as a friend. She accepted and even offered to use her photography skills to take pictures at the party and make a memory book for Clayton. She's a very nice girl.
Yes.
On December 27th, she'd had the photo book printed and drove over to Clayton's house to give it to him. The two sat on the couch talking together about the party and where they were both going now that he was done with his doctorate and Sophie was moving to Wellington. After a short time, though, Clayton began to try to hug and kiss Sophie, to which she replied that she wasn't interested in a romantic relationship anymore and she just wanted to be friends. Clayton then asked her to come to the bedroom, and she got really angry, saying, "You're not getting the message. This is over." And Sophie got up to leave. But as Sophie later wrote in her diary, Clayton's whole demeanor changed on a dime. He became enraged, grabbing her and throwing her over his shoulder. He threw her roughly on his bed and held her down with his body as she screamed,
This is the
trying
first.
to fight him off.
This was the first time he was physically abusive to her.
I think this is the first time it was recorded, maybe, but
Okay.
I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't think we can know that for sure. At one point, Clayton put his elbow on Sophie's throat and covered her mouth so the neighbors wouldn't hear. But she managed to get away, running to her car while Clayton shouted after her that he hoped the plane she'd taken to Australia would have crashed and killed her on the way back. She later wrote in her diary, quote, "I've never had a guy use his weight against me like that. He was furious and extremely unreasonable." Sophie was so upset by this incident, and rightfully so, that she actually went to Clayton's office at the university on January 7th, 2008 to confront him about his behavior and how she was going to report it to the authorities. But Clayton denied anything happened between them and also told Sophie that he'd been telling everyone at the college that she had psychological issues and delusions. Of course. And so basically the gist here was that no one would believe her if she reported him. So Sophie left and decided to cut off all contact with Clayton. Okay. Just 2 days later, on January 9th, 2008, Sophie was at home with Leslie, packing up her room for her big move to Wellington. Her father was away on business, as he often was, so it was Sophie with her mother. While she was organizing her things, the doorbell rang and Leslie went to answer it. Leslie yelled up to Sophie that Clayton was at the door and that he had a present for her. Sophie gave her mom an exasperated look from the top of the stairs, but said Clayton could come in. As he got to her room, Sophie told him she was busy packing, so if he wanted to talk to her, he'd have to do it while she was working. Now, Leslie stayed downstairs to give the two some privacy, but after only 10 minutes, Sophie came down and told her mother, quote, "I don't know what he wants. He's just sitting there not saying a word." So Leslie advised Sophie that she should just tell Clayton to leave. She had so much to do to get ready for her move, and she didn't need Clayton doing anything more to distract her. Sophie went back upstairs, but Amy, only seconds later, Leslie heard her daughter scream. Leslie ran upstairs, but Sophie's bedroom door was closed and locked. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. She could hear her daughter screaming for Clayton to stop, but Leslie could not get the door open.
Oh, it's so. I could not imagine how powerless that mother would feel.
No, this is an awful. I mean, this is exactly. There's really no words for this. She kicked and shouted for Clayton to unlock the door, but he didn't, and Sophie just kept screaming. Leslie raced downstairs to grab her phone, dialing emergency services, while also pulling a meat skewer from a drawer to try to unlock the door. When she got back upstairs, she heard a rhythmic thumping, and then she assumed at this point that Clayton was sexually assaulting her daughter. Just awful. Yeah. As she told emergency services where to go, she shoved the meat skewer in the lock and managed to pry the door open.
Wow.
But what she found inside was not a sexual assault. It was a murder. Clayton was violently stabbing Sophie in the chest over and over as she lay unmoving on the floor.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, this is such a horrible scene. Still on the phone with the dispatcher, Leslie screamed he's killed her. The dispatcher urged Leslie to leave the house. There was nothing she could do. She had to save herself at this point. Honestly, I can't imagine having to make this choice. She's done everything she did. She ran outside at this point and meeting a police officer in the driveway only a few minutes later, probably because she couldn't figure out what else to do. This poor mother.
I'm assuming they got there pretty quickly.
They got there quickly, but it wasn't quick enough. The officer went in and he found the door to Sophie's room closed and locked again. The officer demanded entry, and to his surprise, he heard the lock click and the door swung open to reveal Clayton standing over Sophie's body. The officer would later testify that Clayton appeared in a normal state as he was questioned about what happened.
So he wasn't.
Yeah, so he said
he wasn't still in a violent rage. He was just kind of calmly.
No.
Wow.
That is correct. He simply replied, "I killed her." And he was later described as standing with his hands by his sides, not shaking, and seemingly in total control of himself. Wow, right?
Yes.
When the officer asked why he'd killed Sophie, Clayton calmly responded, quote, "For the emotional pain she put me through this last year." Clayton did not resist arrest. He allowed the officer to handcuff him and take him into custody. As he was being put into the patrol car, the officer asked Clayton whose blood was on his arms, legs, and torso. He replied, "A little bit mine, but mostly hers."
He's I'm sure we'll get to this, but he sounds like a sociopath.
Obviously, it's hard for us to make that kind of diagnosis, but it sure does sound that way from his statements and from his other behaviors. But hold off on that. With his own on-scene confession and Leslie as an eyewitness, there wasn't much else police needed to charge Clayton for the murder of Sophie Elliott. However, what they did need to unpack before Clayton was brought to justice was the excessively brutal nature of the attack and exactly why it happened. I mean, this is really shocking. Her cause of death was ruled as severe blood loss, and her autopsy report showed that she'd been stabbed 216 times with a kitchen knife and a pair of scissors. I mean, this is clearly an excessive number of stab wounds. 2 of those wounds had pierced her heart and left lung, as well as a series of deep slashes across Sophie's throat that had severed her carotid artery.
Do you know how long the attack lasted?
A couple of minutes.
Wow. Okay.
She also had 7 injuries from blunt force trauma, as well as defensive wounds that proved that she'd fought for her life. The autopsy also found that Sophie had been disfigured, with parts of her body, I would say, I don't know how a better way to say this, but most synonymous with maybe you would say beauty or physical looks being cut off. So, I don't always love to get into details, but I think it's important to this case. Let me describe. Her ears had been cut off. Her left breast had 11 stab wounds, and the nipple of her right breast had been cut off. So she had been stabbed through her eyes, her nose, and parts of her genitals were mutilated. So this seemed like these were attempts to disfigure her in places that, were, again, maybe you could say synonymous with some, I don't know how you would say this, but these were attempts to disfigure her, and I think to disfigure her looks in some way.
Her poor mother had to see this. So horrific.
I know. And, I have to tell you, what is not clear either if these disfigurements were done during the attack or post-mortem. So most sources seem to hedge on the side that they had been done post-mortem, though Clayton never received a penalty for desecrating a body.
Okay.
The Emmy would later testify that the type of attack done on Sophie was one of persistence, focus, and determination. So it seemed targeted in the way that he attacked her and where he attacked her. But, the question is, why had Clayton done this? And I think in order to know the why, we should probably look at who Clayton Weatherston was before Sophie.
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
I'm curious if he has any history of violence at all.
A look into his past would reveal that this was not the first time he'd been abusive towards a romantic partner. In 2004, Clayton had dated a woman who described him as almost a Jekyll and Hyde personality. On the one hand, he could be incredibly generous and loving, but he was also nasty and demeaning on the other hand. Their relationship seemed to play out similarly to Sophie's experiences in the on-again, off-again, loving and hating type of dynamic. Clayton's ex also described Clayton as being insecure and that he got worked up over insignificant things that he just couldn't seem to let go of. And what she said was by 2006, things had gotten violent, where after an argument, Clayton allegedly kicked his ex in the back and then jumped on her neck trying to break it.
Oh, jeez.
This woman escaped, ended the relationship that night, and never looked back. Okay, so he does have a history of violence against women. By looking deeper into Clayton's childhood, his family described him as always being incredibly anxious and that any change to his routine or trying new things caused him intense anxiety. He was a behaviorally difficult child, according to his own mother, and he had issues with bedwetting up until the time he was around 12 years old, which is pretty late for bedwetting. Now, while I couldn't find any evidence that he suffered from being bullied, there were reports that he had terrible eyesight but refused to wear glasses until he was in college for fear of being made fun of. So again, couldn't find evidence of it, but it might have been part of his anxiety was he was afraid of being bullied for this. By middle school, Clayton began channeling his anxiety and insecurity into being the highest academically achieving student of his year. And he did excel in this area, earning valedictorian of his high school class and moving on to be a top mark student at the University of Otago as well. However, while he was excelling, he became obsessed with perfection to the point where he'd drop a class if he knew he wasn't going to get an A. He'd then retake it the following semester after he secured the fact that he would have this high grade. He also struggled to take tests. He would work himself up beforehand, like so much so that he would get sick and throw up before regular exams. By the time he was working on his master's degree, he went to seek help from the Student Wellness Center, where he was given special accommodations to retake his tests, as well as being prescribed Prozac to help him with anxiety. But the Prozac didn't seem to help his personal insecurities, nor did it seem to help him with fitting in. Though he had many colleagues and tangential acquaintances, most people regarded Clayton as being what they described as weird or off-putting. And he'd made many enemies, in fact, in the economics department. But none of this could truly explain why Clayton had murdered Sophie Elliott so brutally, especially since in his police interview, he claimed Sophie was actually the one who attacked him with the pair of scissors, and he'd only acted in self-defense. I'm
assuming no one's going to buy that.
Yeah. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that the kitchen knife Sophie had been killed with was from Clayton's own home, and he brought it with him when he confronted her.
Yeah. Okay.
So that would really be, hard to dispel this, or it would be easy to dispel the idea of self-defense. Now, it would be up to a court of law to prove why Clayton had brutally murdered Sophie Elliott. So it's time to play one of our kind of, I would say, favorite games, knowing like what we do. Do we think that Clayton decided on a plea deal, or do you think that he is going to go to trial? Amy, I'm just curious.
I think he's going to trial.
And you would be right. And that's why you are our great criminologist. Just so you know, also, New Zealand's plea deal process is very, very similar to the United States without going into full details. However, as you correctly guessed, Clayton opted to go to trial, pleading not guilty to murder. Instead, under New Zealand's 1961 provocation bill, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, proclaiming that Sophie had provoked him into killing her.
How are they going to explain that he brought the knife with him?
All right, well, hold that thought. Tell you what happened here. The trial began on June 22nd, 2009, and lasted for 5 weeks as both sides brought in a slew of character witnesses, both for and against Sophie and Clayton. The defense tried to paint Sophie as a promiscuous woman who was obsessed with Clayton while also enjoying sleeping with other men, as she had pursued other sexual experiences during the times they were broken up.
Come on, didn't the family go through enough? I can't. We just
That's
talked about
sleazy.
this on a recent episode of Women in Crime. I cannot stand the blaming the victim. And
And
even
to go after her personal character.
even if she did those things, it doesn't even matter. Even if she did, that has no place here.
No, it does not. The defense argued that due to the unique nature of Clayton's personality, he was ill-equipped to deal with Sophie's mood swings and psycho nature.
Oh, God.
Literally, which eventually caused him to snap. This is what they are saying, that she's a promiscuous psycho. That word came up.
Wow. And this
They
is pretty
all-
recent. This isn't like the 1800s.
This is 2009. No.
Disgusting.
They also claim that Clayton had a personality disorder, which made it even harder for him to deal with Sophie's alleged promiscuity. Can you believe this?
No, I don't.
And while we don't see this often in criminal trials, as we've acknowledged, Clayton took the stand himself, though this move did not go well for him. You can YouTube it as you want. I think you're going to find it pretty gross. You know, he has, I think also he's arrogant. He also like smirks and smiles at times, which, you know, just doesn't come across well for him. And he's disparaging this innocent victim, this girl who he's disfigured with her mother outside a door. So I really don't think it was a good move for him. In fact, the Otago Daily Times described his time on the stand by saying he, quote, did not understand how much trouble he was in, nor did he realize the depth of ill feeling his actions had aroused. It seemed like Clayton was really minimizing what he had done. Also, according to the Otago Daily Times, Clayton's case was not helped by the fact that a psychiatrist was brought to the stand right after Clayton finished his testimony, in which the psychiatrist testified that Clayton had signs of obsessionality and narcissism. So remember you had mentioned earlier it seems sociopathic? Well, he definitely had narcissistic traits, that's for sure. Now, despite the defense's tactic to paint Sophie as the catalyst for Clayton's snapping, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty of murder, not manslaughter.
Good.
Yes, very good. Very relieved here. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 18 years.
Okay.
And while Clayton tried to appeal several times on the grounds that the televised trial caused a, quote, lynch mob mentality over his actions, he ran out of his appeals in 2011, which means that Clayton Weatherston is serving out his life sentence and will be eligible for parole, however, in 2027.
Oh, that's soon.
Now, because the non-parole period was 18 years. So New Zealand is less punitive than the United States, as most countries are, I think. So curious, Amy, do we think that this is an appropriate sentence?
No, I don't.
I do not.
No,
Yes. No.
not at all.
No. What scares me, really terrifies me, is that after this amount of time, Clayton will just be about 50 years old. He didn't show any remorse. I don't know in that time if he will, but this does not seem like a severe enough sentence
I
for his
agree.
actions.
Nope.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this was justice according to the New Zealand system and their sentencing scheme. And so while this was considered justice for Sophie Elliott, having Clayton in jail will never bring her back, nor will it repair the psychological trauma her mother Leslie experienced on the day of her daughter's murder. To cope, Leslie wrote 2 books. I can't even imagine this. The first was a memoir entitled Sophie's Legacy, a mother's story of her family's loss and their quest for change. And this one explains the horror of Sophie's death, the grueling process of the trial, and a challenge to New Zealand's justice system on how it treats victims during trials. I'm sure that this was like being victimized all over again, hearing the defense paint Sophie as a crazy, promiscuous woman who somehow incited this violence. I'm very incensed by this one. This one really bothers me. Okay, the second book, called Loves Me Not, How to Keep Relationships Safe, it gives advice to young people on how to identify abuse in relationships, how to deal with relationship issues, and where to seek help in instances of abuse. Leslie also ran an anti-domestic violence campaign through the Sophie Elliott Foundation from 2010 to 2019, where she and Sophie's father partnered with local law enforcement and the Ministry of Social Development to create educational programs for teens on how to avoid domestic violence. On a much larger note, Amy, Sophie Elliott's murder made waves in the New Zealand courts of law. The fact that Clayton had been allowed to even enter a guilty plea by reason of provocation due to that 1961 provocation law enraged New Zealand citizens. I think it kind of enraged us as well.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, as the chief executive from the domestic violence shelter Women's Refuge told the press, quote, "The provocation defense is based on absolutely archaic notions about violence. Once upon a time, society accepted that an affront to male privilege or dignity was a reasonable excuse to fly into a homicidal rage. This trial turned justice inside out. The killer became the victim, and Sophie Elliott was portrayed to us all as he chose to describe her." I don't think anyone could have said it better.
Nope.
However, the hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who watched Clayton's trial saw through his attempts to make Sophie the villain.
Good.
And the public cried out for change following this trial. Just 1 week after Clayton's verdict was released, an amendment bill was sent to Parliament requesting an abolishment of this provocation law, many feeling that it was antiquated and really a re-victimization. And by October of 2009, just 4 months after the trial ended, the bill was approved and the provocation law was officially abolished in New Zealand.
Great.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes these tragedies have a silver lining, and hopefully this silver lining will deter anyone from trying to, again, victimize a victim again, her family. So I'm very glad to see that there was at least this outcome with this antiquated law.
It's so absolutely awful that her mother had to deal with all of this.
I know, I find this one really heartbreaking, knowing that her mother had to endure. I can't believe sometimes what families do with these tragedies. Like, her mom turned around and became an advocate, hardcore, helping with domestic violence, writing books, channeling this. But still, her pain, there's no amount of good work that could probably ever really repair the pain, the long-term pain and trauma that she experienced.
Nope.
Okay. Well, while New Zealand may be one of the safest places on the planet, Sophie's brutal murder is a reminder that domestic violence can be found anywhere, even in safe universities, and that violent people may not always appear so at first glance. Now, Clayton Weatherston was a well-spoken, polished PhD candidate who was an educated man and a good teacher, at least on the surface. Unfortunately, by the time Sophie realized who Clayton actually was, it was simply too late for her. If any of our listeners are or know someone who may be suffering from domestic abuse, there is always help available. So the National Domestic Abuse Hotline is 800-799-7233. And this is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week line with operators speaking both English and Spanish. You can also visit thehotline.org for more information on how to be an advocate to identify potential domestic violence and how to help someone you know who may be in a domestic abuse situation.
Before we go today, if you'd like to support Campus Killings, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts.
Your subscription will get you VIP access to all the shows on the network that not only includes hundreds of episodes of ad-free listening, but also bonus content and early access to episodes.
For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting this show in the process.
Head over to Apple Podcasts and search for either Campus Killings or AbJack, and you can start your subscription with a free trial.
Your support is greatly appreciated.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Campus Killings.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook at facebook.com/Campus Killings. You can also visit the show's homepage at campuskillings.com. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.
What you wear says a lot about who you are. At Coldwater Creek, we believe your clothes should tell your story effortlessly and with style. For 40 years, Coldwater Creek has been inspired by the beauty of nature. We design with rich, seasonal colors and prints that reflect the world around us. Crafted with care in every stitch, every fabric chosen for its comfort and quality. Whether you're exploring the world or enjoying life at home, you'll find clothes that move with you, comfortable, timeless, and fit just right. While fashions change, our promise to you never has, to bring you beautifully designed pieces that feel as good as they look, with thoughtful details and surprises inspired by nature's own artistry. Let your wardrobe say what words can't. You're confident, adventurous, and you're doing it all effortlessly. Find your next favorite piece at coldwatercreek.com. Clothing, shoes, accessories, and more, crafted just for you.
I started using when I was 13. It was like, oh, well, they're prescription opioids, so they can't be that dangerous. My perception was once you stop using, like, that's it, your life is over. I didn't even realize that I needed help until the day that I got arrested. I have been able to accomplish a lot in my recovery. I just want to be happy and I want to thrive in my life.
If you or someone you know is struggling, there is hope. Recovery is possible.